Introduction. For the BBJ Calendar widget portion of the presentation, we'll cover the BBJ Calendar widget plugin and a lot of what it can do. But first, let's take a quick trip down memory lane to TechCon 17, where we first saw a BBJ program using the full calendar jQuery library. That will give us a better understanding and perspective of how we could go from this TechCon 17 calendar demo to this BBJ Calendar widget program that details New York University's public calendar entries in month, week, day, and list view. Years ago at TechCon 17, we looked at how BBJ and JavaScript can communicate with each other. We covered how BBJ can execute client-side JavaScript code in a BBJ HTML view control, and how the JavaScript code can send events and arbitrary data objects back to the BBJ program running on the server. To demonstrate these capabilities, we walked through the process of Googling for a jQuery calendar plugin and choosing the full calendar library, downloading the source code, writing a BBJ program with a window and a BBJ HTML view control, loading the HTML view with a div for the calendar, injecting the JavaScript libraries, instantiating the calendar, and finally running the demo. The result was a BBJ program with a fully functional calendar, which was nice, but empty. So the next steps were to add appointments to the calendar, enable the drag and drop capability of calendar entries, and have the calendar notify the BBJ program when the end user changed an entry. And now we're back to the present day, where a few years have passed since that presentation. Looking back, the demo was pretty exciting at the time, despite its limitations, as it showed how we could leverage a mature JavaScript library in a BBJ application. However, our program was extremely limited, as it only dealt with a single user event and only touched on a tiny fraction of what the full calendar library was capable of, largely ignoring all of the library's configuration options and event callbacks. What we learned. There was a lot of low-level code required to get the calendar up and running. For example, we had to inject the jQuery, full calendar, and moment.js JavaScript libraries into a BBJ HTML view control before we could even think of creating the calendar. And once we got the calendar up and running, we had to write custom JavaScript code to notify our BBJ application whenever the user dragged an entry from one day to another to reschedule an appointment. Basis realized that despite the full calendar library's power and flexibility, integrating it into a new or existing BBJ application required too much upfront development effort for many application developers. And asking developers to learn a new language just to integrate a calendar into their applications was a pretty big ask. If only there were a way to simplify the entire process and eliminate the need to know and write JavaScript. It would be ideal if BBJ programmers could integrate the full calendar into their applications, but be able to treat it similarly to other BBJ controls. Thus, the idea was born to create a plugin that takes care of all the initial setup, custom JavaScript code, and event communication for the BBJ application developer. We can think of it as the second in a series of plugins that uses pre-existing JavaScript libraries in the BBJ HTML view control, where the first was Basis Europe's BBJ Grid EX widget. The BBJ Calendar widget, installed with BBJ21, relieves the application developers from having to learn and work with JavaScript by providing a plugin that handles all the low-level details, saving weeks or even months of development time. Now, adding a calendar control to a BBJ GUI, BUI, or DWC application isn't very different from adding a traditional control, and we can do it in a single line of code. And the best part? You don't have to worry about learning JavaScript. During this portion of the presentation, we'll explore many of the BBJ Calendar widget's features and capabilities. We'll also cover the various BBJ Custom Classes that comprise the plugin and how they're used. And of course, we'll walk through several examples that put the plugin through its paces. The full calendar library. Under the covers, the BBJ Calendar widget uses the full calendar JavaScript library. This library is open source and free to use, even for commercial products. It's actively developed and maintained with over 100 contributors and still enjoys constant improvements. This is impressive, given that it was first created in 2009. Luckily for us, the developers of the full calendar library haven't been resting on their laurels, and have been continuing to add new features and fix bugs. Amongst other improvements, the full calendar library has eliminated its dependence on the jQuery library, and its vanilla JavaScript API is now blazing fast and uses a small, embedded virtual DOM library. The upshot is that there's less JavaScript overhead, and the code executes more quickly and efficiently compared to the traditional methods of modifying the DOM directly. Besides the size and speed improvements, the full calendar library has continued to advance over the years, making it one of the industry leaders. It's used by several prominent companies, including Amazon, Netflix, Samsung, PayPal, and even NASA. And if you're still not convinced, the library currently boasts over 20 million CDN downloads every month. A tour of the BBJ Calendar widget. The BBJ plugin is a set of BBJ Custom Classes that make it easy to add a functional calendar to a BBJ program in as little as one line of code. It takes over all of the grunt work associated with creating the HTML view control, injecting the JavaScript libraries, and best of all, it simplifies the two-way communication between the BBJ application and the full calendar library. You can think of the BBJ Calendar widget as the middleman between your application and the full calendar library. Despite the differences in computer languages on either end, it acts as a translator so that you can focus on your BBJ application code and don't need to deal with any JavaScript code. As you can probably imagine, the full calendar library is extremely capable and offers all kinds of options to cater to a variety of use cases. We couldn't possibly cover all of them in this presentation, but we'll cover some highlights by reviewing the demos that are installed with the plugin. Demo 1. Unlike some of the plugins available from the BBJ Plugin Manager, the BBJ Calendar widget is always available. That's because the BBJ installation process installs the latest version in the BBJ Home Plugins BBJ Calendar widget directory. But even though you don't need the Plugin Manager to install it, it's a handy way to run the demo programs that ship with the plugin. After launching the Plugin Manager and selecting the BBJ Calendar widget in the grid, we can select and launch the demo programs, starting with the first demo that creates a fully functional calendar in a BBJ window. Even though we have added no entries to the calendar, we can still navigate backward and forward to different months and years, as well as change the view type. We'll review the other demos during this presentation, as they exploit some of the plugin's more interesting features. The plugin offers a few BBJ object-oriented classes that let you get the most out of the calendar. These classes give you access to dozens of calendar configuration parameters, such as whether the calendar should be editable by the user, whether to display weekends and week numbers, defining the first day of the week, and even defining entry colors or applying a pre-built theme. You can also create an instance of the calendar entry class to create a single event, or add several of those to a BBJ vector to add multiple entries to the calendar more efficiently. There are also classes that define entry sources, so it's easy to add entries to the calendar from web services in iCalendar or JSON format. These also make it possible to add entries from public Google calendars in a read-only format with very little code. And you can still add entries programmatically. All you need is an entry title and a start time to create a basic entry. This means that you can read appointment data from many sources, including mkeyed files or a database table, create one or more calendar entry objects, then add them to the calendar. The BBJ Calendar widget wasn't meant to be a static display of appointments, although it is possible to lock it down and prevent users from modifying any of the entries on the calendar. Its real power comes into play as you configure it to be editable by the user. There are a few parameters that determine how editable it should be, and you can empower users to reschedule appointments by dragging and dropping an entry from one day or time slot to another. Users may also intuitively change an entry's duration by dragging its starting or ending edge. Event callbacks. Your application can register for the end user's events with traditional callback syntax, which allows you to execute custom-tailored code after the user interacts with the calendar or its entries. This means that you can load the calendar with entries from a database and let the user change them. Whenever the user reschedules an entry or adjusts its duration, The BBjCalendar widget executes your callback routine and provides a custom calendar event object. When the user edits an entry in that manner, your application gets two copies of the calendar entry from the event, the original version and the updated version that includes the user's changes. Your callback routine can then update the appointment data in the source, database, or file, persisting your user's modifications. There are several other callbacks available as well, so your app can be notified when the user clicks on a date or appointment, the user changes the date range, such as advancing to the next or previous month, the user selects or unselects a date, which can be useful for date or range selection. The user changes views, such as switching from the month view to the list view. Additionally, Basis has added a new interface to enhance working with any user event that contains the low-level client-side JavaScript event. Instead of having to parse the JavaScript event directly, now it's simple to determine extra event information by executing traditional BBJ get methods. For example, many events now support getting the mouse coordinates, which developers can use to position a pop-up menu next to the calendar appointment in response to a user's click. It also simplifies getting the specific modifier key states, such as whether the Alt, Control, or Meta keys were pressed during the mouse click. This makes it possible to support several different operations for a single click based on the state of the keys. The BBJ Custom Classes. Your application code will typically deal with just a couple of custom classes: the BBjCalendar widget class itself that represents the calendar control, and the Calendar API class. For example, the first basic calendar demo shown earlier declares the myCalBang variable as a BBjCalendar widget object and then instantiates the object via the Calendar API class. The Calendar API class is often used to create objects, such as the actual calendar object in this example. It's also used to create entries, entry sources, options, and even custom toolbars. This line of code created the calendar in the simplest possible way, by calling a method that takes a single parameter, a window or a child window that will contain the calendar. There are other creation methods that take more parameters if you want greater flexibility and control over the calendar. And the Calendar API class is a handy way to access constants, such as the calendar's view types and callback events. And since we declared the myCalBang variable as a BBjCalendar widget object, we can now benefit from code completion when writing code in the Eclipse BDT editor. We're presented with all the methods for the object, including generic ones like setSize, setLocation, that are common to all BBJ controls. Other available methods, like getDate and navigateDate, are specific to the calendar object itself. Code completion like this really helps give the developers an overview of what each class object can do, and can dramatically speed up the development process. The code completion is available because Basis split up the classes into two versions: an unprotected interface that details all the methods and provides Javadoc comments to create the reference documentation, a protected implementation class that provides the code for each method. And speaking of Javadocs, if you're ever curious about how to use a class, or would like complete descriptions of its methods and all their parameters, then you'll definitely want to check out the reference documentation. For example, viewing the Javadocs for the Calendar Options class tells us how we can customize the calendar's display through methods like setInitialDate, which you can use to force the calendar to display the desired date instead of defaulting to the current date. There are several other classes that define specific aspects or capabilities of the calendar object, and we'll briefly touch upon them when looking at some of the other demo programs. Demo 2. The second demo builds on the first by adding entries to the calendar, but it must first set a callback so that it's notified when the calendar widget has completed its initialization and is ready for interaction. What exactly do we mean by completing its initialization? Recall that in the TechOn 17 demo, we had to load the HTML view with a div for the calendar, inject the JavaScript libraries, and then instantiate the calendar. With the plugin, all of that still has to take place, but our application code doesn't have to know anything about it. All that it needs to know is that the plugin has taken care of everything and the calendar is ready to go. So we accomplish that with the following callback code. With this callback in place, the BBjCalendar widget will execute our custom code in the onCalendarReady subroutine, which adds 3 entries to the calendar. Now that we have entries on the calendar, I can change the entries interactively. For example, I can move my vacation to next week and extend it to take up the entire week. In the day view, I can extend the duration of an event by moving it or dragging the starting and ending edges. Demo 3. Adding entries to the calendar one by one is certainly useful, but it's also possible to add a pre-existing source of multiple entries via an entry source. Entry source feeds are a way to add multiple calendar entries to the calendar at once from a source, like a public Google Calendar, a web service that provides entries in JSON format, an iCalendar or ICS file, etc. After launching this demo, we notice that the calendar is set to the purple theme and injected some custom CSS to modify the display of all of the calendar entries, such as the custom highlight for today's date. It also preloads all the demo data from the full calendar library's demo feed, adding a custom class name and more CSS to further customize the entries. After clicking the Remove All Sources button, we can view a few entry source feeds by selecting them from a BBJ List button. After selecting the weather feed, clicking on the Add Source button adds a public Google Calendar weather feed to our calendar, starting at the current week. There aren't too many entries, as we have yet to perfect the art of weather forecasting. So instead, we can choose something more predictable into the future, such as moon phases. After adding this source to our calendar, we can navigate to future months and view the date and time for lunar events, such as a full moon. Note that we can add, refresh, and remove individual sources, so we can go back to the weather feed and click the Remove Source button to view only the moon phases. I've changed this demo by adding one more calendar entry source, a custom BBX servlet that generates entries based on the current date and provides them in JSON format. After adding that source, notice that it added an all-day entry to play with the BBJ Calendar widget, as well as tonight's dinner plans and yet another vacation. If we want to peek under the covers to see how that happened, we can point our browser to the BBX servlet URL. All the entry information is in JSON format, or JavaScript Object Notation, a standardized and lightweight data interchange format that's easy to read and write. Looking at it like this, all bunched together, probably causes you to doubt the easy to parse claim. But since it's a well-defined format, we'll switch from the raw data view to the JSON view to get a better understanding of the data. It's broken down into 4 entries, which we can expand and collapse individually. Looking at the first entry, we can easily tell that it's an all-day entry, starting on today's date, with a descriptive title. The simplest entry type only requires a unique ID, starting date and time, and title. But our servlet goes even further by setting custom colors for the entry's text, background, and border. Demo 4. The fourth demo changes things up a bit by first creating a calendar options object, customizing several options, and then instantiating the calendar with these custom options. That means that the calendar will be configured exactly as we'd like it when it's first displayed. That makes for a better user experience compared to displaying a standard calendar, then having it flash after we apply customizations. Some of the new options include setting the initial view to the weekly time grid, turning on the Now indicator, changing the slot's minimum and maximum times. But more interestingly, it sets the valid date range to only 3 days, starting from yesterday. So even if the appointments are editable, we're still not allowed to move them out of our 3-day range. Demo 5. Instead of having the calendar take up the full BBJ window, this time we split the window vertically, with a command palette on the left and an embedded calendar control on the right. The left palette contains a dual set of checkbox entries corresponding to all of the tags associated with the entries. Calendar entries support any number of custom tags that you can make use of later. The calendar entry object has several methods to facilitate tag management, such as adding and removing tags, setting and getting tags, and methods to see if an entry contains a particular tag, one out of several, or contains all of the queried tags. To illustrate how we can use tags, the demo dynamically hides or shows entries when the user checks or unchecks a checkbox for the tag in the top Visible Tags or the bottom Hidden Tags section. To begin with, the calendar shows all events, because we haven't selected any of the checkboxes yet. By checking the Exercise Visible tag, we've instructed the calendar to only display entries with the Exercise tag. We can make more entries visible by checking the webinar tag. After unchecking those, the calendar reverts to displaying all entries. We can then take the opposite approach and instruct the calendar to hide specific entries, such as those with the programming tag. By toggling that tag's checkbox, the calendar will hide and show the entries with that tag. The big programming entry at 2 o'clock, as well as the 8 a.m. webinar covering writing effective code. Besides adding tags to the entries, this demo also adds group IDs. That means that we can work with all entries that match a particular group ID by modifying one of the group's entries. All of the morning weightlifting entries share the same group ID, so I can change all of them at once by modifying the duration and/or starting time. This demo reports on all of the entry information via standard BBJ message box whenever you click on a calendar entry. So clicking on a weightlifting entry displays a prettified JSON representation of the calendar entry, as well as everything contained in the actual calendar entry click event object. In the calendar entry definition, we can see that its group ID property is set to weights, as are all of the other weightlifting entries. We can also see that it has 3 tags: personal, exercise, and weights. By attaching multiple tags to entries, we've made it easy to toggle the display of work and personal appointments. Notice that there is a URL associated with this entry that points to a website's workout routines. This one is a push-pull routine, so when we go back to the calendar, we can Alt-click on the entry to open up the workout routine in another tab. As we've just seen, calendar entries support a number of useful properties for appointment information, such as group ID, location, and URL. But what if you wanted to include more information, such as an entry icon, a Google Map link with directions, who created or last modified the entry, etc.? Luckily, all calendar entries support extended properties that are simple key-value pairs, which we can use to store data like this. And the Calendar Entry API has several methods to facilitate this process, making it easy to set, get, add, and remove extended properties. There are even methods that let us query whether an appointment contains a specified property key or value, so developers can add as much information to an entry as needed. Lastly, we set another callback, this time for the on-calendar date click event. With this in place, whenever we click on a date in the calendar, such as today, then our callback code gets a calendar date click event object. From that, we can get the date that the user clicked and then tell the calendar to navigate to that date. We'll also change the view type to the day list view so that the user sees an agenda for their chosen date. Demo 6. This demo focuses on calendar navigation methods and shows how developers can navigate the calendar programmatically to specific dates. We're already familiar with the calendar's toolbar buttons that let the user navigate to the next or previous day, month, or year. Developers can do the same thing using the BBJ Calendar widget's corresponding navigation methods. This demo's top section contains several BBJ controls that mimic the calendar's navigation buttons, and they call navigation methods on the calendar object when pressed. There is also a BBJ list edit control filled with dates in several formats that gives us the opportunity to test out different date formats. Ideally, we would format all dates and times in the ISO 8601 format, or at a minimum, YYYY-MM-DD for dates and HH:MM for times. The full calendar prefers this format because dates expressed this way work internationally, are easily sorted, and are never ambiguous. But dates and times have the potential to be stored in a variety of formats, and the BBJ Calendar widget tries really hard to figure out what the user or programmer meant when working with a date in an ambiguous format. The demo shows that the widget can successfully interpret dates with different separator characters and various orders for the day, month, and year. The ISO 8601 format allows you to specify everything needed for a particular point in time in a single string, including the date, time, and even time zone. Demo 7. The last demo reads and writes calendar entries to and from an empty data file. This program has a BBJ child window on the right that contains a few demo options and a bottom section that details the selected entry's attributes. After I click on the Breakfast with the Boss entry, my program executes callback code to get the calendar entry object from the event, determines the entry's attributes, and loads them into the form. We can see that it set the entry's starting and ending dates and times based on the information from the entry itself. And if I reschedule the breakfast event to tomorrow, note that the program updates the start and end dates accordingly. The demo will save all changes to the entries automatically based on this options checkbox by writing them back to the emptied file. To test this, we'll drag the breakfast entry to next week, then exit the program. After relaunching, the breakfast entry is still set for next week, just as we had expected. Recap. The BBjCalendar widget demos, easily launched from the plugin manager, have given us a taste of what's possible when we add a calendar to a BBJ application. The demos are generously commented, so it's possible to scan the code to learn how to interact with the calendar, particularly with callback code and the custom event return objects that give you access to everything you need to know about a particular event, entry, or the calendar itself. While writing the demos, we were so inspired by the calendar that we even added a completely over-the-top unnecessary feature, a custom window icon showing today's day and date. The BBjCalendar widget plugin offers much more than what we've covered here in this presentation, but keep an eye out for an upcoming Advantage article series covering the BBjCalendar widget classes in detail, as well as a technical overview, step-by-step tutorial, and some advanced topics.
In BBJ21, Basis introduced a new servlet implementation called BBjCervlets to replace the older BBjSP and BBjServlets. The goal in developing BBjCervlets was to provide performance and quality of life improvements over BBjSP servlets. We also wanted to separate the servlet implementation from the BBjSP system, making the BBjCervlets easier to support on our end and more reliable on your end. Today, I'm going to walk you through what exactly BBjCervlets are, how they can be used to enhance your web development, and how you can get started with BBjCervlets today. So for those unfamiliar, let's start with a quick rundown of what a servlet actually is. A servlet is a Java object that is used to extend a web server by processing web requests through custom code that can allow users to flexibly handle incoming web requests. Simply put, a servlet is a class that handles web requests, processes them, and replies back with a response. Servlets can also be used to set cookies on a client browser, process cookies from an incoming request, and parse URL parameters. Servlets are considered to be a RESTful or representational state transfer technology, meaning they don't maintain state. Rather, each call made to a servlet contains all the information they need to successfully complete their tasks. This makes them platform independent and not constrained to one format like SOAP web services or CGI. Instead, they use a variety of web formats, such as XML, JSON, YAML, or whatever else is required for your application. Basis has put the power of servlets in the hands of users for years with BBJ, BBjSP, and now BBjCervlets, allowing you to write BBJ programs designed to receive web requests, process them, and reply with response objects, all without having to learn a new programming language. This makes it incredibly easy for BBJ users to perform the same functions as Java servlets in BBJ. So now that you know what servlets do, you may be wondering, what exactly makes BBjCervlets new and exciting? While BBjCervlets possess the same capabilities as previous servlet implementations, they also bring several improvements to the table that make them a better choice than BBjSP and BBjCervlets for your web development needs. For starters, BBjCervlets are going to be supported for longer. With BBjCervlets having long been deprecated, there was a need to replace them with something comparable, and though BBjSP servlets were the logical next step, their close ties to BBjSP made them difficult to support as an independent servlet. For this reason, BBjCervlets were made to be independent from BBjSP, so that they would be easier to support on our end and have much less overhead than BBjSP servlets. Which brings me to my next point. BBjCervlets are faster than previous implementations. In a performance test of all three servlets, BBjCervlets delivered a response roughly 3 times faster on average than both BBJ and BBjSP servlets. And when load tested with 5,000 requests, BBX servlets were able to handle and respond to all requests significantly faster than both implementations. BBX servlets are also easier to configure than previous servlets. With BBJSP and BBJ servlets, the problem would often arise that if a servlet was configured incorrectly, you would not find out about it until you tried to actually run the servlet. And even then, sniffing out the problem was not as simple as it could have been. With BBX servlets' improved configuration error reporting, finding misconfigured options is as simple as looking at a pop-up alert and making the necessary changes. Gone are the days of wasting time debugging an unresponsive servlet that just had a mistyped character in its file path. BBX servlets also use a connection-based licensing model that will only check out one license for each connecting machine, as opposed to a license for each request. This remedies licenses being held up due to a high volume of requests or one client making multiple requests to the same servlet. So let's look at an example of how BBX servlets can be used in a practical application. Let's say you are wanting to display calendar entries from a database with the BBjCalendar widget, while also allowing the database to be dynamically updated based on changes made to the calendar itself. You could go through the process of manually creating individual calendar entries and adding them to the calendar with the BBjCalendar API, or you could write a servlet to do it all for you. With a BBX servlet, you could write a program that retrieves the calendar entries from the database and returns them in JSON form. You would then simply have to define the servlet URL as an entry source for the calendar, and now the database entries will be displayed. You could also make this work in the other direction as well, where entries added to the calendar could be sent to a servlet in JSON form and added to the database to keep everything in sync with each other. So the question now is, how do you get started with BBX servlets? As with all things BBJ, the BBJ documentation has a wealth of information on everything BBX servlet related. This includes method descriptions, a step-by-step tutorial on writing a BBX servlet, as well as numerous sample servlets to really help you get a feel for all BBX servlets have to offer. But don't worry about memorizing all that information, as BBJ 21.20 introduced a BBX servlet file template in the Eclipse BDT with everything you will need to start writing. So let me just quickly walk through the process of writing, deploying, and accessing a servlet. You would first start by creating a BBJ file, whether that be through the Eclipse BDT, a text editor, or Vim if you're a real renegade. You would then create a BBJ class containing a service method. When it comes to servlets, the service method is where all the magic happens. This is going to be the method that is called whenever a request is made to the servlet. In previous servlet implementations, this method had to be called service, but with BBX servlets, it can now be called whatever you'd like in order to allow for multiple service methods to exist in a single BBJ file. The service method takes a single argument of the type BBX servlet context. The BBX servlet context is a new BBJ object that contains the web request and web response in the form of objects called BBX servlet request and BBX servlet response. The BBX servlet request is the incoming object that contains information about the web request made by the client. This contains header information, client cookie data, file uploads, URL parameters, and anything else sent along with the request. The BBX servlet response is the outgoing object that allows you to print to the servlet's output stream, set cookies, send error codes, and redirect the client to another page. If you've worked with BBJSP servlets before, then these objects should look familiar to you, as they are direct analogs to BBJSP web context, BBJSP web request, and BBJSP web response. This should make it very easy for you to migrate your BBJSP servlets into BBX servlets, as all you'll need to do is change the names of these objects in your code, and you'll be able to carry out the same functions. After you've written your servlet, the next step is going to be registering it to a context on your Jetty server and giving it a mapping. The mapping will define the URL that the servlet will use to be accessed. So if you wanted to publish your servlet to your website, www.bbjuser.com, on a context called BBJ context, and you wanted to map your servlet to servlet, then your URL would look something like this. To register the servlet, you can either use the Enterprise Manager or the BBJ API. In the EM, navigate to the Context Configuration tab under the Web drop-down menu and select the context you want to add the servlet to. If you scroll down, you'll see a section labeled BBjCalendar. Here, you can click the green plus button to add the servlet. This will prompt a configuration window to pop up. You can then simply fill in the mapping, the source file, the class name, and the service method. Hit save and restart the context. And thanks to the improved error reporting, if there are any errors in your configuration, then a window will pop up notifying you of what went wrong so that you can quickly fix it. The other method for deploying your BBjCalendar is through the BBJ API. To do this, you must first access the BBJ context configuration object for the context you wish to add the BBjCalendar to. You can do this with the following code. You would then use the add BBjCalendar method, passing in the mapping, the servlet source file, the class name, and the method name to add the servlet to the context. If any errors occur, they will be printed to the console and you'll be able to quickly fix them. Next, you'd restart the context with the following code, and there you go. It's as simple as that. You don't have to waste any time struggling with complex and opaque configurations, and because BBjCalendars are dynamically loaded each time a request is made, any updates you make to the source file will immediately take effect, removing the need to re-register every single time you want to test a change. So in conclusion, BBjCalendars are faster, easier to use, and more reliable than BBJ and BBJSP servlets. Hopefully you can use them to enrich your web development experience. And with BBjCalendar currently fully functional in BBJ with future developments on the way, now is the time to get yourself up and running with BBjCalendar.
The next section of this session is about the BBJ Grid EX widget plugin. I will revisit what the BBJ Grid EX widget is and illustrate the optional enhanced license you can obtain for it. I will give you an overview of new features that had been added recently and close with why we think the BBJ Grid EX widget should be relevant to your work with BBJ. The BBJ Grid EX widget is a plugin that adds a feature-rich, user-friendly data grid to BBJ. If you are unfamiliar with BBJ's plugin concept, visit bbj-plugins.com to learn more. The plugin comes with demos that illustrate both the features and functions as the user sees them in your application and the code behind these features. With these demos, you can quickly get an idea about how to use the Grid plugin in general and how to implement specific features of it. When you install the plugin into your BBJ, you can use all its standard functionality as long as your BBJ license is under SAM. Give your users features like filtering, sorting, grouping, column pinning, or column drag and drop with little additional effort. Thanks to the underlying third-party JavaScript component we have built on, you can add additional attractive features. We at Basis have negotiated a favorable pricing structure with the vendor so that for a small fee of only $5 per year and concurrent user, you enable its enhanced features. It's probably important to mention that the user count for the enhanced grid in your license does not have to match the total user count you have. You can purchase the enhanced functionality for a smaller subset of your users and control by its API who should get the license and who of your users continue to work with the standard version. The enhanced features include ad hoc charting, pivot tables, a tree grid feature, and a few more user-centric features to its UI. I have used the BBJ Plugin Manager to install the BBJ Grid EX widget on my machine. The Plugin Manager allows you to run the demos directly from its UI, but as a developer, I have used my Eclipse IDE to look at and start the demos directly. The demo directory hosts a number of useful demos that mostly show functionality which is available in the standard version. The subfolder Enhanced shows a few more samples that illustrate features of the enhanced version. Let's look at one of the simple demos, the CD Store. This demo shows how to populate a simple grid from a select statement. When we run it in GUI, we can see it load records directly from the CD inventory table. The user can now drag and drop the order of the columns, sort the data by clicking on the column header, or use the filter in the column menu to filter by contents or value. I recommend browsing and looking at all of the demos if you start working with the BBJ Grid EX widget in order to get an overview over all features that work in the standard version. I have now enabled the license for the enhanced BBJ Grid EX widget on this computer and have started the CD Store demo from the plugins demo folder. You can see that there is now new controls on screen that the user can use to work with the data in the grid. Immediately visible is this new drawer on the right, which I can open, and then I can switch on and off the visibility of certain columns. There is also a more comprehensive list of the filters, which might be useful to now combine filters in a comprehensive way. Also, the menu for each column has now received direct options for the user to pin columns or group columns by himself. This would only be available to you as a developer in the standard version. So for instance, I can pin this column to the left. Or I can now use the group feature to group by the recording type. And you see I get a nice structural view of my data. But not only does the enhanced license directly improve the usability of the grid with things that the user can use, there are certain features that become only available under the enhanced license. The Filters API demo is written to work in both the standard and enhanced version. When running with an enhanced license, it illustrates how to enable so-called set filters on the data in a certain column. A set filter shows the distinct values within that column for the user to select and deselect with individual checkboxes. This feature is known from many spreadsheet applications like Microsoft Excel. Let's look at another one. The charting demo shows how to create charts on the grid. When we run it, we see a chart that is created by program code and overlays the data. The API offers various chart types and formatting and positioning options. In addition to your program, the user can also create charts directly from the UI. The last demo of enhanced features in this short summary is the tree grid. Other than the grouping of data we saw earlier, you can use the tree grid of the BBJ Grid EX widget to provide a true independent tree control on the left that controls the data rows on the right. In this sample, we see a file system structure. There are many more enhanced features you might find interesting. Contact your sales representative to obtain your license for the enhanced feature set of the BBJ Grid EX widget. Since its first release, the BBJ Grid EX widget has evolved quite a bit. Besides a few minor improvements, it has received two features that I will present to you now. We have added full editing support. Now you can not only use the grid in your queries to browse data, but also for data entry. The second feature we added recently for the browser-based clients of BBJ is the horizontally aligned scrolling of two separate grids, which is fully implemented as a client-side feature and does not produce any server round trips for optimal performance in thin client deployments. Let's have a look. There are three programs that illustrate the new features, two for editing, one for the horizontally aligned grids. Let's start with editing. The program editing.bbj shows editing for various data types. I can click into grid cells and start typing. Date fields get a nice date picker, and timestamps add an hour-minute portion to it. Booleans get a slider toggle in this sample, and number input is controlled by the usual BBX masking rules. To the right, we see a drop-down select cell. The order lines BBJ is written as a potential order entry grid for items from the Chili Company sample database. I can enter an item number and a quantity. The quantity column has, for the purpose of demo, a validation to allow only numbers below 10, and you see how the row updates as the user enters data. We're closing with a look at the horizontally aligned two grids, this time directly in the browser in the new dynamic web client. As we can see, the grids control their horizontal scroll position directly based on their own, but also on the scroll bar of the linked other grid. You have seen that the BBJ Grid EX widget improves the user experience of your application and comes with a lot of useful features. It performs well, especially in BUI, and makes your life as a developer much easier with its new API that can build directly on the data structures of your application. By upgrading the data grids in your code to the BBJ Grid EX widget now, you make it ready for the dynamic web client. The BBJ standard grid and its siblings will not be brought to the dynamic web client as you know them from the past. So the BBJ Grid EX widget is the step you can start implementing now, not only to give your users immediate benefit, but also to get ready for the next generation BBJ thin client, the dynamic web client. And now it's time for your questions.